Okay, imagine you're a specialist, a biologist, and you're called in to examine a specimen of some kind to understand what it is. And this specimen has been killed and taxidermied, and it's in the home of a wealthy collector in Hamburg, Germany. Now, you've come in there and you're looking at it, and it's basically a beast with 7 heads. And this thing is for sale for a huge amount of money. In fact, even the King of Denmark has bid on it. Now, as you're inspecting it, you begin to see that the thing, while being very well done, is in fact a kind of taxidermy hoax. It's been stitched together from various different creatures. And when you discover this, you realize you've got some fairly important information on your hands. Now, you could reveal this to the owner and to the newspapers. That would drive the price of the sale way down and also get you in serious trouble. Or you could keep it to yourself and let the sale go through. Now, what would you do? That's exactly the dilemma that Carl Linnaeus found himself in the 1730s when he was inspecting this incredible Hydra creature in Hamburg, Germany. So today we're going to discuss the Hydra as a monster that goes back to the ancient world. It's reiterated in the book of Revelation, and it has a wonderful sort of history in the Renaissance and the early modern period, and really all the way up to the present. So today, the Hydra, and in particular, the Hamburg Hydra and Carl Linnaeus. All right, here are some of the images that we're doing for today's episode. It's a combination of digital drawings like this one, and then old school drawings, charcoal, with this one, and then again a digital portrait of Linnaeus himself, our hero, and finally an old school combination of colored pencil, acrylic paint, based on a wonderful George Inness painting. So let's talk a little bit about the Hydra as we draw here. You see me laying out this creature on the iPad using Procreate, and I'm basing this on a wonderful image by Albrecht Dürer, the great German artist from the Renaissance period. And the Hydra really goes back to the ancient Greeks, and it's referred to in many of their texts, most notably, I suppose, Hesiod's Theogony. And there we learn that Heracles or Hercules has to fight this creature, which was basically created by Hera as a way to in a sense, to kill Hercules. When Hercules meets this thing, it's at Lake Lerna, which is in the Greek Peloponnesus, and this is the lair of the Hydra. And Hercules basically goes in, and this thing's breath is so bad, or it smells so bad, that Hercules has to cover his own mouth and nose in order to fight it. Otherwise, he'll succumb to the poisonous fumes. And there at Lerna, he confronts the Hydra, and there's various different accounts of it. He can't seem to kill it because every time he cuts a head off, of course, 2 of them grow back. So it's kind of a metaphor for hopelessness or despair in struggle. But, you know, Hercules being the hero that he is, he soldiers on, and he works out a kind of a strategy with his nephew. And what happens is, of course, Hercules cuts the one head off, and then the nephew, Iolaus, basically cauterizes the head with a torch, and that prevents the sort of growing back of the 2. And that's how he's able to defeat it. And Hercules then dips his, some say it's his sword, and others say it's his arrows into the blood of the Hydra, and then he's got a sort of poisonous weapon that he can use ever after when fighting against various creatures that he has to encounter. So there is this long tradition. It's not clear from the original sources that it should have 7 heads. That emerges later. Sometimes it's just referred to as having multiple heads. It appears again in Virgil and in Ovid. But then, of course, we get a new version of it in the book of Revelation in the Bible. And there again, we get a multi-headed sort of dragon creature, but here the 7 heads are stipulated. And the book of Revelation, you might recall, is also sometimes called the Apocalypse of John. And it's written in the early 90s of the Common Era during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. It's beautiful, it's frightening, it's a jumble of end-time forecasts and conspiracy history and thinly veiled socio-political, theories. The description of monsters involves, among other things, a giant red dragon, and that's going to be our Hydra. And then a hybrid leopard bear lion beast and a two-horned beast that emerges from underground. And I should probably devote separate episodes to these things, and I'm sure I will in the course of Monsterology, set aside some time for these. The dragon plays a crucial role throughout the apocalypse and also down through the ages as a symbolic counterpart to Christian virtue. But it's unclear whether John's influences were Greek or Near Eastern, maybe both. The author of the Revelation, which is John, he spins this kind of elaborate mystical vision of the end of the world and explicitly draws on the earlier prophetic traditions to reinforce and to kind of validate, his call for repentance. His confusing visions entail a trinity of terror that focuses on the central demonic character of the giant seven-headed dragon, or Draco, who is called the devil and Satan, explicitly referred to in that way. There's some great stuff that happens. There's basically if you do read the Apocalypse or the Book of Revelation, you'll see there's sort of a symbolic child is born, which seems to be the Messiah. The dragon then menaces the woman, waiting to devour the child, but the creature's evil plan is thwarted because the son is born. Once the son's born, he's immediately whisked up to God and his throne, and the woman escapes to the wilderness. And then come battles. The creature fights Michael and his angels. Most scholars agree that the author of the Book of Revelation is providing a kind of coded narrative about the religious persecution of Christians. It's a persecution that received some imperial sanction under Nero. You remember Emperor Nero being particularly odious, and may have come to a kind of acute struggle under Domitian. The symbolism is further nuanced by the introduction of two monstrous henchmen, the false prophet and or sometimes called pseudo-prophetess, and this there's like a 7 cat-like heads and horned beast of the earth and of the sea. And eventually the Protestants read the beast as the Roman Catholic Pope, and then the Catholics returned the favor by reading the beast as Luther himself. In any case, this was to basically start the end times. And just back to the drawing here for a moment, what you're seeing now is the drawing of the saddest, most depressed Hydra that I could find, and this is the one that our hero Linnaeus actually examined in Hamburg. This is the image. The drawing I did is based on an image from a collector named Albertus Seba, who was a Dutch collector, and this was in Seba's collection. It was basically a book called a thesaurus, and he believed this thing to be real. So one of the things the young Carl Linnaeus did was he goes to Hamburg to inspect this thing, which has appeared in many scientific volumes by the time he goes in the 1730s. The monster, which is in the burgomaster's cabinet and has 7 heads and sharp teeth and frightening claws and so forth, it was a well-known subject of the science of the day, in part because of Seba's thesaurus, but also Peter the Great was interested in it and believed it to be real. It's interesting then that when Linnaeus looked at it and investigated it carefully, he saw that it was a fake, or that it was basically a really good hoax of taxidermy, and he did in fact report it as such to the owner and to the local, what counted for a press. And news basically traveled very quickly that the whole thing was a hoax, which meant that the sale price plummeted and went down through the basement, and that meant that Linnaeus was actually in some trouble and had to get out of town very quickly. So he raced out and survived and went on to become really probably the greatest naturalist of the modern period until Darwin came along in the next generation. So this is just my way of expressing Linnaeus, who was primarily a botanist, so I wanted to draw plants all over him and do him in green as a kind of homage to his scientific discipline. Linnaeus is oftentimes portrayed as the great rationalist. He's in the traditions oftentimes of Newton and others who brought on the scientific revolution. What I'm doing here is a painting based on a wonderful painting by George Inness, which is about that quote from the Bible, which is essentially though I walk through the valley of darkness, I fear no evil, for you are with me. And this is a painting that Inness did to sort of express that religious view of hope, even amidst despair. I include it here because I wanted to say a word about Linnaeus and monsters generally. Linnaeus, again, is oftentimes thought to be a rationalist like Newton, but then we've discovered more recently that, hey, you know what, Newton wasn't that much of a rationalist either. He was secretly doing all kinds of alchemy on the side and was a believer in a kind of hermetic, magical tradition. And it's fascinating to discover that Linnaeus, too, had a sort of secret interest in metaphysics and theology and magic. And he wrote a small notebook, which really no one ever reads, and many, I think, history of science scholars don't even know about. It's called Nemesis Divina, which translates to be divine retribution. And this is a small notebook that he compiled of God's revenge upon nature and man. And it was a secret little notebook that he bequeathed to his son, warning him to guard it carefully and use it only for his own benefit and the benefit of the family. So it was sort of like secret wisdom that he was passing on. In it and elsewhere, Linnaeus kept quoting this line from the Roman poet Ovid, and the line is basically, in Latin it says, innocua vivito numen adest, which means live blameless because God is here. And this was basically Linnaeus's deep theological conviction. And he wrote to his son when he gave him this book, he, quote, there was a time when I doubted whether God bothered about me. Many years have taught me what I leave to you, which is this little book. It is the wish of all to be happy, which few can be. If you wish to be happy, then know that God sees you everywhere. End quote. And then Linnaeus basically fills this notebook with stories. Some are personal and some are political, in which God takes a kind of revenge. So he tells the story about when he was away, some guy tried to hit on his wife and woo her and steal her away, and God seems to have punished this guy by ruining his career. And so there's all these stories like this. So Linnaeus and other sort of seeming rationalists of the period are not quite the sort of atheistic deists that we're oftentimes taught. They frequently think in much more metaphysical ways. And he basically was sort of committed to what we would call a physico-theology, which is sort of a doctrine of balance and compensation. So God stocks nature, but in a sort of balanced way. And if things get out of balance, then God has to send retribution and revenge and restore harmony. So this creates, what we might call the sort of problem of evil in Linnaeus. You might see that some species break out of their native and natural ecological environment and go into other and become sort of predators in another environment, and so God has to come and wipe them out. And this was Linnaeus's view of God's justice, both in nature and with regard to human beings. I just think it's a wonderful point to make because Linnaeus, it's oftentimes thought that, the rationalists come along like Newton and Linnaeus and they sort of get rid of all the monsters and all monsters go away. And yet, actually, the more we learn about these interesting characters from the early modern period and from the Enlightenment period, is that they're much more nuanced, subtle, strange in a way. They're really weird. I mean, it's a kind of a strange combination of what we might call naturalism and rationalism, like science as we know it, but also there's remnants of much more anthropocentric and even theocentric worldviews. In fact, I would sort of summarize all of it by saying they have a kind of mythopoetic view of nature. That's basically a good place to sort of wrap it up. You see what I've done here is a combination of drawings and techniques to give you a picture of not just a Hydra, but maybe even a chapter from the history of science and the way we think about monstrosity generally. If you like this kind of thing, please hit the subscribe button and come back for more content. I put up stuff every couple of weeks.